this is fun, right?
Ambassador, so great to have you. I have to tell you, of all the events in Washington, D.C., this summit is one of my absolute favorite. You look across the room here today, the heavy hitters in foreign policy who are making a difference in gender, and the women, the next generation of people here. I'm just so thrilled. And we're excited that you could be here for this conversation.
I'm thrilled to be here. It's my first time at this summit, so wonderful to be here.
Definitely not the last, I'm sure. Definitely not the last. You know, Ambassador, you started in your 20s in the 1970s in India as a counselor, focusing on listening to girls, and that's how you got into this field that you're in today. I want to read you something that you wrote back in 2009 for Foreign Policy. It was a letter to the editor, and this is what you wrote. For the United States to be effective in repairing its image abroad, any rhetoric must be backed with adequate funding for investment in proven strategies that promote gender equality. That was 14 years ago. How are we doing on this topic?
I can't believe you unearthed that quote. I do remember writing it. I wrote it when I was president at the International Center for Research on Women, and it was my job then to hold the government accountable. It's very different when you're inside government. But I have to say that I'm blessed to be in an administration that's committed to gender equality. One of the most incredible things that I learned when I joined was that President Biden had made a commitment in 2021, March, that he would recommit to it, and he followed through by putting in place a Gender Policy Council in the White House. And that's the kind of thing, when I was at ICRW, I used to ask for, is that you need the leadership at the top, you need the right structures and policies, and then you need the money. And that's what President Biden has done so well, because he's got the Gender Policy Council. They issued for the first time ever a US national strategy on gender equity and equality, which sort of guides both domestic and foreign policy, and involves all of the departments within the government. And then he put resources against it, because the following year, he actually announced that he would double the gender equality related foreign assistance.
That's significant.
Incredibly,
in a big way.
Incredibly significant. $1.3 billion to $2.6 billion.
That's
for
a lot of money.
For FY23, and that goal was met.
That goal was met.
So,
it actually happened, because a lot of times money's allocated, but it doesn't get to the right place sometimes.
No, it actually happened, and USAID and the State Department worked very hard to make sure that it happened. And now he has upped it by another $500 million, so we are shooting for, he's made sort of a request to Congress for $3.1 billion this year for gender equality, and so we have to work towards it. But as you know, the appropriations bill that just came through has cut budgets for USAID and for the State Department, so we're going to have to see how that's going to be possible.
When you look at the landscape of gender equality work, what do you find is your biggest challenge when you're looking abroad on this issue?
The biggest challenge, there's so many challenges right now, it's actually quite the perfect storm, right? Because you have the climate crisis, you have the largest number of conflicts that are occurring right now since World War II. We've never had these many concurrent conflicts. You have eroding of women's rights across the world. And that effort in particular is the one that I'm most worried about, and the one that I talk about a lot when I travel, which is the concerted, well-funded, directed attacks on girls' and women's rights that are occurring globally. It's very well-funded. It's an international effort, whether that's the erosion of women's rights in Afghanistan or the repeal of the ban against female genital mutilation in the Gambia that's now being considered, whether that's the online harassment and abuse that's targeted to women political leaders and those running for political office, so much so that the participation of women in political office, that curve which was going this way all these past 2 decades, for the first time this year has plateaued, and I suspect may begin to drop. Because a lot of the women I talk to who are in political office say they will not encourage younger women to take political office.
That's so sad to hear. So, I mean, when you talk about the backsliding, you were mentioning oppressive areas. You mentioned Afghanistan. When you look at Afghanistan, how can we support women that live in places with these oppressive governments when you can't even have conversations in many cases with them? How do you move policy forward in a place like that?
Yeah, it's very, very sad to see what the Taliban has done to women's and girls' rights in Afghanistan. If you've been following their 50-plus edicts, and I just heard this morning that they're imposing stoning for all kinds of crimes. It's horrific. The incredible thing is that the administration actually put in place a special envoy for Afghan women, girls, and human rights in the State Department. Reena Amiri is my colleague. She is based in my office, and we work very closely together. And she has, certain efforts that she's trying to make happen. So in all negotiations, for example, she makes sure that girls and women are center in those negotiations. In all her multilateral interactions in the UN, she sort of prioritizes women and girls. In she's sort of come up with very creative public-private partnerships to make sure that through the internet and online, that girls in Afghanistan and young women can develop the skills that they need to be able to get jobs and to even perhaps work from home.
Because we know education is important.
Incredibly
it is
important.
Statistically proven to make a difference. When you look at data, I do a podcast for foreign policy called The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women. And one of the things we focus on in this podcast is data, the value of data. I think it's a theme throughout today's conference. When you look at data, can you point to an example where having the hard numbers made a difference in foreign policy?
Data is so important. It's why I became a researcher. I will tell you that across the 4 decades of my career, it is evidence that has shifted policy significantly. First example is the fact that poor, illiterate women with no collateral are in fact credit-worthy. The data point that showed that women repay loans at 98% was what created the microfinance movement and really made that movement thrive. Second data point was the fact that women who are in this one, I was involved in personally through a Women in AIDS research program at ICRW, which showed that women's vulnerability to HIV is actually due to their economic vulnerability and dependency. So when you are dependent on a male partner economically, and your children are dependent on that male partner, to negotiate protection or to have any kind of leverage is almost impossible. And that particular data point, which came out of 16 studies globally, resulted in what you now see as one of the flagship programs of the PEPFAR program, the President's Emergency Relief Program for HIV, which has a program called DREAMS, directed to adolescent girls and young women, that sort of weaves together HIV prevention treatment with economic opportunities and job skills training. I had the opportunity to visit one of those projects, and I can tell you it is wonderful to see how women who are very vulnerable to resorting to sex work as the only avenue to earn money, or are vulnerable to men who they're dependent on, who may have multiple partners, being able to be economically independent and use that. So I saw women who had set up hairdressing salons. Not only were they economically active themselves, they were employing other women in their communities. So I think that it is evidence and data that shapes foreign policy. I think it's very important to have that. There's plenty of data that's exists that's sex disaggregated. Unfortunately, it doesn't get compiled as such and doesn't get used. Because almost all surveys will have male or female, and now increasingly they allow for non-binary, but when it is collated, it's not reported out that way. They don't do the analysis to do those comparisons. That's the tragedy. So what I think initiatives like Data 2X and others are promoting is the need to do that analysis, and then once you do that analysis, to actually use it. To use it to shape the decisions you make.
It's been one of the biggest eye-opening things for me in working in this podcast and looking around the world and the people we profile, is how much data can be so transformative. You focused a lot on women's economic security, as you mentioned. Give us a little bit of hope here. Where have you seen the biggest wins in this space?
So in my office, I'll tell you, before I joined, before I was confirmed, the biggest win for me was that the US for the first time announced a global strategy on women's economic security, which had in it, and I was really happy to see that, because often when we think about women's economic security, we immediately move to entrepreneurship.
Yes.
Somehow all women are supposed to be able to be businesswomen.
Which is like, just having a job alone is hard, but let alone having to think about the whole structure of
right.
making it.
So we never talk about jobs and women's jobs in the formal sector. So what's wonderful about this strategy is it actually emphasizes the need for women to be economically competitive for jobs in the labor market. And one of the wins, I think, these days is going to be about the blue and green economies that are flourishing now, and the tech economy that is flourishing. And women need to be trained to enter into that, and the recognition and the different ways in which the State Department, and especially my office, is pushing for STEM education, mentorship, leadership opportunities for women in STEM, with the private sector in particular, is where the hope lies. I think the private sector has been the innovator in terms of women's economic participation, but can do a lot more.
How so? Why is the private sector so important?
They're the ones who have changed their retention and recruitment policies because they see it affects the bottom line. So they're motivated to do it. And I feel that public-private partnerships will result in it becoming more the norm than it currently is, to give women an equal chance to thrive in the economy.
I have so many more questions for you, but I'm so grateful for this time. We're going to have to leave it here for now. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you, sir.
And now, please welcome to the stage United Nations Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed for a conversation